Okay, so I know a lot of you probably have issues with the sensory systems, the ALS and the DCML pathways, and so I'm just going to give you kind of a step-by-step process of how to tell them apart, and this should help you like lay a foundation for how to recognize them and how to know where your sensory information is coming from. So we'll draw out the spinal cord, like he does in lecture. So that's your spinal cord. You're going to have the kind of brainstem right here in the thalamus. And on top is going to be where the brain actually starts. Alright, so let's mark this. This is the spinal cord. This is the brainstem. Thalamus. And then this is part of the brain, and it's called the somatosensory cortex. So the goal is to get the stimulus from out in your body to go all the way up to the somatosensory cortex in the brain. So it's good to be aware of where the midline of the spinal cord is, so we'll draw that in. And be very aware of where the neurons cross the midline, so where information on the right side of your body is then switched over to the left side and vice versa. And that'll make some more sense in a second. So we have two pathways, DCML, which stands for dorsal column, medial lemniscus. And that's how you spell it. And then our other pathway is the ALS, or anterior lateral system. Now the important distinction between these two pathways is what type of information they're receiving. So the DCML pathway brings in information about fine touch. So we'll do this. This is fine touch. And something called proprioception. And all proprioception is knowing where you are in space, like where your hands are in relation to your body. And think of it like if your eyes were closed, you still know where your hands are. You can put your hands together, you can touch your face, you still know that physical area. The anterior lateral system is slightly different because it brings in information about crude touch, so harder touch. Pain and temperature. And make sure you memorize which type of stimulus goes through which system, because that will definitely be something he focuses on. So, both of these pathways are pretty similar. There will be 3 neurons, a primary, a secondary, and a tertiary neuron. And the only difference between them is where they synapse onto each other. So let's draw out an example. Say you have a receptor out here in your hand or anything, and it's attached to a neuron that's going to go into your spinal cord. We're going to start with the DCML. So this is the DCML pathway. This is your cell body right here, and it's always in the periphery. It's not inside the spinal cord. And just to remind you, this is called the dorsal root ganglia. If I could spell. Dorsal root ganglia. And that's just a grouping of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. So, if this is the DCML pathway, this is our primary neuron. So it's going to receive the stimulus from the body, and then the cell body will be outside, but it will enter into the spinal cord and go all the way up to this area where it synapses onto the secondary or second order neuron. Here's the cell body of the secondary neuron. And the secondary neuron is going to cross the midline. And you go all the way up here. Synapse onto the tertiary neuron, which will then enter the somatosensory cortex. So secondary, tertiary. Now an important thing to know is this area here is called the dorsal column nuclei. And all that means is a nuclei is a grouping of cell bodies in the central nervous system, so inside the spinal cord and brain and all that. And it's the grouping of cell bodies for the DCML pathway, which is why it says dorsal column. Okay, so this is your first system. It's pretty similar to the ALS though, in that the primary neuron is the one receiving the stimulus. It will enter the spinal cord and it'll synapse onto the secondary neuron. The second order neuron always crosses the midline and then synapses onto the third order neuron. So that's going to be the same for both of these. Now let me show you the difference. We're going to start with another neuron down here. And this is going to be for the ALS pathway. Its cell body is going to be right here. Again in the dorsal root ganglia. And it's going to enter the spinal cord. The difference is it synapses onto the second order neuron way down here, wherever it enters the spinal cord. The second order neuron then crosses the midline, as it always does in both pathways, and then it will go all the way up here, synapse onto the third order neuron, which will then enter the somatosensory cortex. So this is primary, secondary, and tertiary again. So that is your main difference between DCML and ALS. They both primary neurons enter the spinal cord. ALS synapses right away and crosses the midline and goes all the way up here. Whereas in the DCML, primary neuron comes in and goes all the way to the dorsal column nuclei, synapses there, and then comes over to this area. And this area is called the thalamic relay nucleus. And again, nucleus is just a grouping of cell bodies, and this is in the thalamus. So that's the same on both sides of the body. On this side, this is the left side here. And this is the right side. You will again have neurons come in with their cell bodies. If this is DCML, it will come in and go directly to the dorsal column nucleus on this side, synapse onto the secondary neuron, crossover, synapse onto a tertiary neuron. And ALS is the exact same too. So you can see how this works, and the main reason he stresses this so much is that the idea of information coming from one side of the body but being processed in the opposite side of the brain. So I would suggest you become very familiar with each of these pathways, be able to draw it out just like we did here, and then think about certain things that could go wrong. Like if something happened to the spinal cord right here, and this whole area was disrupted, what kind of sensory information would you lose from the opposite side of the body? So be able to trace these lines up here and down here, and think about what information is this individual losing from which side of their body if an injury occurs right here. So I hope this is really helpful. And later we can talk about the motor system, which is kind of the opposite. It's sending information out to your extremities.